We're on, we're live streaming. Okay, wonderful. So without further ado, we're just going to go straight into Charles Eisenstein. And I'm just going to say that I had a chance, well, first I asked him what he would like me to say for the introduction. And he said, forget my bio. And I think that's a great sign, you know, when the speaker says, don't worry about, you know, what happened before, it's what's happening now. And so I thought I would just say, you know, I had a chance to talk with him yesterday. We did this this public radio, this community radio interview, where we sort of got to hear our varying perspectives and live figure out, you know, where they connected. And you know, I felt like, wow, this is sort of the poetry of what we are as a movement, and maybe it's sort of the existential life and spirit of the movement. So I'm very excited that Charles is here, and really excited to hear his, you know, his thoughts and his vision and his take on our vision and how the two really work together and make each other stronger. So let's give a warm welcome to Charles Eisenstein. In terms of our all eating and sharing the food, we broke some rules here, as sometimes we do. Bad rules sometimes need to be broken. And we all ate, and we all shared food, and it turns out it wasn't paid for by everybody, so we have to pass the hat to make sure that we paid for the food that we all shared and enjoyed. So when the basket comes around, just drop something into it. So take it away, Charles.
All right, thanks. So the question is, am I stuck behind this thing? Or does this work too? No. So maybe I am sort of stuck behind here. Okay, well, we'll deal with it even though most of my good parts will be hidden. So I was thinking today of a story was going through my head, a little event that happened, I guess it was a year or two ago. I was speaking at the story's in my book, so I apologize if you've read it already, but I was speaking at some kind of conference on socially responsible investment or something like that. And one of the speakers was this lady from Nestle Corporation. She was a vice president, I think. And she gave a really, really polished, eloquent, witty, well-done speech on how Nestle is such a good corporate citizen, you know, and how they're using, you know, 40% less plastic than any of their competitors, and they've, you know, set a new industry standard, and they're protecting the orangutans and this and that and other thing. Like really well done. I mean, it was to the point where Paul Glover had to leave the room because he felt nauseated. You know, I don't know if any of you know Paul, but he's, you know, a long time, yeah. So, and I was pretty curious about this woman. So after the talk, I went to have a few words with her. And before I could get to her, there was a young college student asking her some questions. Really sharp questions. Things like, I understand that 40% less plastic is good, but wouldn't it be better to not use any plastic at all? And you know, like, boy, that's an interesting idea. But no matter what the student asked, this Nestle vice president had a ready answer, such as, well, didn't you know that the process of refining petroleum into gasoline produces the raw materials for plastics? If we didn't use them to make plastic bottles, they would just be dumped anyway. We're not really doing any harm. She would have an answer like that. So then, no matter what the question was, she had, you know, a response to it. And I thought, okay, you know, and she responded, and you know, with humor, with respect to this young person, like looking her in the eye, you know, like she was a very likable person. I thought, okay, what's going on here? One possibility is that, geez, I've been wrong about Nestle the whole time. And they've really turned the corner, and they're trying really hard to make themselves sustainable, and all of these environmental problems, they're on it. And they're going to innovate their way out of it and lead the way for all of us. That would be one interpretation. Another interpretation is that she is a well-paid, highly trained corporate apologist who's cynically drawing on the research of her PR department to put together mendacious arguments to justify their corporate greed. She's either a hypocrite who doesn't really believe any of it, but she's saying it because she's paid to, or she's a dupe of their own propaganda. But she didn't seem like an awful person. And that response I recognize as the same kind of othering, the same kind of dehumanization that is at the root of, racism, for example. That's at the root of US foreign policy, where we other and dehumanize whoever we decide is the enemy, the terrorists, the militants, or whoever it is. It's the same mindset. So what would be another alternative to those two possibilities? Because I'm just not quite ready to go there to become a Nestle fan. That was a joke. What would be an alternative? And so what I think is that she is the captive of a story. And the story goes beyond Nestle, good corporate citizen, because the arguments she made are almost impossible to overcome if you accept her premises. If you accept the premise, for example, that the petroleum industry is going to have to stay more or less the way it is because we need gasoline, because that powers our wonderful suburban industrialized lives of comfort and convenience. If you accept that as a premise, then what are you going to do with the byproducts that we make plastic out of? If you accept as a premise, one thing she said was people need convenience because the pace of life is speeding up all the time, and besides, tap water is no longer safe. So bottled water is a lot better than soda, right? If you accept, of course they make soda too, but we don't need to dig that deeply, but if you accept that premise that life is going to be speeding up all of the time, that our destiny is to become more and more technological, more and more efficient, that life is going to keep moving faster and faster, this is generally a good thing. If you take that for granted, if you take for granted that the tap water is going to decline in quality, then bottled water is a good thing. So in order to change her mind, you have to change the deeper stories that she's living in. What I'd like to put out here today is that those deeper stories go all the way to the bottom of that they are part of the deep mythology, usually invisible, that runs our civilization. That, in fact, the world as we know it is built on a story. And on one level, it's quite obvious. Anything that you want to accomplish in the social realm, you can't do it with your own two hands. You have to be able to enroll other people in your project. You have to be able to tell a story that creates meaning, that coordinates human activity, that offers roles for people to play. And these stories are part of a whole constellation of stories that I call mythology, and it includes such things as money. Money is a story. Physically, it's nothing. It's just bits and computers. It's symbols. But these have tremendous power because of the stories that we share about them. And if one day those stories, those systems of agreements and meanings break down, then it reverts to being just what it is physically, a bunch of paper, a bunch of bits and computers with no reality, which is, in a way, really good news, because so much of what we take for real when we talk about what's practical and what's realistic has to do with these agreements, which can be changed. whatever, $15 trillion worth of debt, or whatever the bankers got away with during the last financial crisis. That could disappear like that if we changed our agreements. So I think that we need to be working with a consciousness that our world, and especially our politics, are built on stories. A corporation is a story. A nation is a story. A border is a story. None of these things exist in physical reality. I could get metaphysical and say that even our selves, our identity, are a story as well. But I won't. Not too much. So it's pretty well known, I think, that the Republicans are better storytellers than the Democrats. They draw people into a narrative, and once you're in that narrative, the narrative acts as a kind of filter that filters out any inconvenient facts that don't fit into the narrative. So you can have people en masse believing the most visible absurdities without any problem, even absurdities that contradict their own economic interests, because they're being immersed in a story. They're being told a story, they accept that story. And the story is, of course, it's not just an isolated intellectual construct. It resonates with an emotional state as well. Maybe a state of resentment, a state of fear, or something like that. The Democrats are not quite as good at telling stories. They have a different story that's not as well articulated, and they keep trying this one, trying that one, checking the opinion polls, see, is this one going to work, is that one going to work, and kind of half-hearted about it. But probably most people in this room know that the story that the Democrats tell and the story that the Republicans tell, these are just kind of variations on theme, and that they share in common other narratives that are basically not questioned. For example, the story that economic growth is a positive good and making everybody better off. The story of America bringing freedom and democracy to the world. The story that we call economic development. These things are basically not questioned in either of the establishment parties. Here, many of us at least, probably see through those stories. I think, though, that on an even deeper level, or I see evidence that on a deeper level, even people in radical activist movements still share some of the stories that run our civilization. So I'd like to kind of frame the process of transition that our society is in the midst of, maybe in a somewhat early stage of, in terms of a transition in our defining mythology, a transition in our deep narratives. And in doing that, I'm going to kind of link together what the larger, what kind of is in common between or among all of the institutions that dominate our society today, whether it's political, agricultural, medical, educational, scientific, religion, so on. All of these institutions and how they enact, well, I'll call it the story of separation. How this story is falling apart and giving way to a new and ancient story that you might call interbeing, interrelatedness, interconnection, ecology, unity, something like that. And how this is really what unifies us. And this came up in the presentation with Jill Stein and George Martin and those folks before lunch. The question came up, well, we have all of these different movements coming together at the convergence in New York City, the climate convergence, and what does unify, say, the peace movement with the environmental movement? And George Martin said, well, for example, look at all of the fossil fuels that the military-industrial complex consumes for no purpose that serves human well-being. There's something right there. So therefore, the peace movement and the environmental movement should be aligned. We could ask the same question about the economic justice movement, the movement for a higher living wage, the movement to heal racism, to house the homeless, to reform the prisons. Like, what unifies all of these things? And you can kind of make these ad hoc instrumental arguments, how each supports the other. And I'd like to describe how they are all the upwelling of the same transition and unified on a really deep level. And that's why we feel kinship. Even though you can't say necessarily how working with the homeless is going to help climate change. I mean, geez, these people out on the streets are living a very, very low impact lifestyle. Their carbon footprint is almost zero, and now you're going to rehabilitate them, and they're going to get jobs and begin producing and consuming. That's bad for climate change. You can make a really cynical, hard-hearted argument like that. And I can't rationally refute that argument, but I know that the people working to end homelessness are doing something important for the future of this planet. No force in the universe can convince me otherwise. So, story of separation. It's been pretty much the guiding mythology of our civilization for a long time. And it answers basic questions like, who are you? What is a human being? How do we achieve well-being, happiness? What's important? What's valuable? Where do we come from? Where are we going? Separation says we are separate individuals in a universe of other. We are bubbles of psychology floating around inside these flesh robots. We are programmed by our DNA to maximize reproductive self-interest. We are an economic man seeking to maximize financial self-interest. We are a soul encased in flesh. All of these different fields of human thought agree pretty much on what a self is, or have until fairly recently. So, from that perspective, here we are in this universe, in this world separate from us. So our well-being comes through exercising control over what is outside of ourselves. These competitors, or the forces of nature which don't care about us. And so human history is seen in this kind of triumphalist mode of an ascent, of more and more dominance over nature, as Descartes put it, to eventually become the lords and possessors of nature. So in the West, we're much farther along toward this glorious destiny than they are in Africa and India and these backward places, but we can bring them along too by going there and teaching them our ways. So this story also has built into it what I call the war on evil, which says that goodness comes through controlling the bad thing outside of yourself. This mindset originated at the beginning of agriculture, where evil was associated with chaos and the wild, goodness was associated with the domestic and the conquest of the wild. And the benevolent ruler was the one who pushed the boundaries of civilization and brought things under control. So we still have that mindset today. And here's one way that what I would call the old story, the story of separation, comes into politics, where goodness victory, a better world, will come through destroying the bad guys, overcoming the bad guys. Now, the identity of the bad guys depends on your political view. So you have, say, this is an issue that I got a little bit agitated about, the MH17 Malaysian Airlines tragedy. So the narrative that is advanced in service to U.S. geopolitical ambitions says that, it was those Russian-backed militant separatists who on purpose did it, or they should have known better, and then they covered up the evidence, and then they did this, and then they mistreated the corpses, and then and Putin was behind it, right? And so there's this narrative, and Putin's the bad guy, and these separatists are the bad guys. And then there's a counter narrative that you don't see so much in the mainstream press. I mean, even on NPR and Huffington Post, they're advancing the kind of dominant narrative. And then there's a counter narrative that's like, hold on here. None of this is as we've been told. The rebels actually didn't close off the site. Here's a journalist going through luggage, and Ukrainian aircraft traffic control diverted the jet 200 miles off course to go right through the war zone. How do we know who actually launched that missile? And there's this. So the bad guys, maybe the bad guys are, the U.S.-backed Ukrainian regime, or maybe the bad guys are the U.S. The CIA or the NSA or whoever engineered this and whoever's operating this propaganda machine. Maybe those are the bad guys. So two very polarized views, but they agree on one thing, that the problem is the bad guys. And the solution is to expose, humiliate, conquer, and overcome the bad guys. So they're agreeing on the deep narrative. But we've seen the result of that kind of revolution before. From that way of seeing the world, you need a bad guy. And if the bad guy disappears, you have to create a new one. So we had the end of the communist bad guy in 1989, 1990, 91, around then. So we had to invent some other bogeyman, the drug lords, the terrorists, or something like that. And so we never got a peace dividend because we're conditioned to that way of thinking. So what's the alternative? I like to call it a new story, but it's really not new. It's draws from ancient roots, indigenous roots, and is still, when I have indigenous people in the audience, they're like, oh yeah, this is what we've always believed, or just only recently forgotten and trying to preserve. But it's the story you could call interbeing. It answers these basic questions very differently. Who are you? You are the totality of all of your relationships. You're the holographic image of the whole world. Therefore, everything that you do to the world, you're doing to yourself. Therefore, everything humanity does to nature, humanity is doing to itself. Not because we have some conditional dependence on nature that if we develop enough technology and synthetic food and space stations, we can transcend, but because nature is part of us, the planet is part of us, and we're part of it, inseparably. What is, in this new story, then what is human nature? Well, a separate self, of course, seeks to insulate itself from the threats out there to maximize self-interest. Why not? Your well-being, what connection does it have to my well-being? That's what economics says. Left to my own devices, I would happily exploit everybody in this room. Well, from the perspective of interbeing, your well-being is my well-being too. So my goal, my fundamental human motivation is to serve the well-being of others. This is an ecological understanding. When I was a kid, I read nature books that one was called The Marvelous World of Insects, and the book said, by the year 2000, it's likely that there will be no more insects, thanks to wonder chemicals such as DDT. And this book was written in like the 50s. And because there are, or maybe we'll have a better managed planet, because there are harmful species, neutral species, and beneficial species. And our goal is to eliminate the harmful ones, because they have nothing to give, and foster the beneficial ones. But an indigenous person knows that every species has an important gift to give. You eliminate it, and you're not better off because, hey, one less competitor. No, you're worse off because the whole community of life lacks now the gift of this one being. So translating that into the human world as ecological beings, in the global ecology and also the social ecology, each of us has a gift to give toward the well-being of the whole. which is also our own well-being, inescapable. And this is what we're learning. This is what climate change is all about. It's this wake-up call that says we're not separate. Now, from the mindset of separation, we're like, okay, how do we use the technologies of control to remedy the consequences of the technologies of control? So then you go into things like geoengineering, seeding the oceans with iron oxide or spraying sulfuric acid into the atmosphere or something like that. And that's kind of more of the same. Instead of saying, how can we serve the totality of life? I think, how far off course do I want to get here? A little bit. I think a lot of climate change arguments tap into an ideology that's part of the problem. The ideology of instrumental utilitarianism, which is a bit of a fancy sounding way to say valuing things for their use to us. So you approach somebody and you say, you should really care about climate change. And they say, why? And you say, well, if we don't do something about it, we're not going to have a planet to live on. If we don't do something about it, well, you don't buy that. Well, what about the economic losses? You can add those up. All these terrible things that are going to happen. Or why should I care about biodiversity in the rainforest? Well, what about the medicines that can be made? They can save your life. All of these say you should care because of nature's use to us. And that kind of thinking, seeing nature as existing for its use to us, is part of the problem. And by making those arguments, I think we strengthen that story of separation that holds us separate from nature. So I think that when we look at, and there's a lot more to the story of interbeing that I could describe, and how it applies to, say, reinventing the money system. That's one thing I've written about. The money system that we have today very much embodies and rests upon the story of separation. It destroys community, it sets us into artificial competition with each other, it generates artificial scarcity, and it necessitates endless growth. The system we have only works with endless growth. That's why everyone's talking about, at least in mainstream politics, about increasing demand, growing the economy, because then you can have more jobs producing even more stuff. There's no other solution offered. And this is coming up in the debate in Minnesota, about the sulfide mines. Well, they're going to create more jobs. We don't have another way, conventionally speaking, to get money to people except to give them jobs, and we don't have another way to create jobs except by producing more stuff and increasing consumption. So, even liberal economists are at least Keynesians. They're like, well, how do we increase demand? So this is one of the deeper questions that we have to begin asking. Can we have an economy that's not based on growth, that doesn't necessitate endless growth, which is profoundly unnatural? Natural processes are cyclic, and they might have a growth stage, but then they reach a steady state. So how can we have a steady state economy that requires a different kind of money system, and underneath that money system, a different meta-narrative? So that's just one example of more kind of practical applications of this transition in our stories. But you can look at all of these things that unite us, or that want to unite us, and that sometimes seem in competition with each other. Peace versus social justice versus environmentalism. These things are all drawing from a new story, a new and ancient story that has never been absent. It's always been present in our culture as a kind of recessive DNA that crops up, that expresses itself in golden moments, like the 1960s, for example. So for example, prison reform and moving away from the paradigm of deterrence and punishment basically says that these are not evil people who commit criminal acts because they're bad, but they're coming from a context that if you were in the totality of their circumstances, you would do as they did. If you were, I don't know, born in the inner city with dark skin and the subject of racism and you have no economic opportunities, and nonetheless you have an entrepreneurial bent and you enter the only business available, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And maybe you were abused as a child and all this kind of stuff. If you were in those circumstances, you do that too. In other words, I am not separate from you. In other words, you are me in those circumstances, and I am you in these circumstances. And then from that perspective, then the whole deterrence and punishment thing is basically, I'm going to put you in a situation where you do things and then punish you for doing those things. And so the understanding of interbeing, which we can say is love, when really the expansion of oneself to include another, that's love. Your happiness is my happiness. My son's happiness is my happiness. Because they're part of me. That's love. When we expand in that way, then a lot of the paradigms that dominate our society today lose their kind of intellectual motivation. For example, punishment and deterrence. For example, seeing poor people as poor because it's their fault, because they didn't try as hard as I did. They didn't compete as well. They're inferior in some way. That's another kind of othering. U.S. foreign policy, the mentality of war. Again, it's overcoming the bad guy. It's creating an other and then trying to defeat that other, which is a very deep programming in our society. I mean, every action movie is about that. All the same plot. And even children's movies, The Lion King. There's the bad lion. You find the bad guy and you destroy him. And that's the solution to the problem. When we buy into that, even if we change the bad guy from the terrorist to the Nestle vice president, or to the Monsanto executive, or to the banksters, or to the politicians, or to the police, then we're still engaging in the same story. We're still strengthening the field of that story. And some visionaries, have understood that. Martin Luther King talked about that kind of thing. You act from hate, you strengthen the field of hate. And I think that's what unifies all of these movements that are coming together in New York on September 19th through 21st. They're all an upwelling of a new story, and they're all contributing to the creation of a society built on that new story. That we're not separate from nature, not separate from each other, not separate from any of the people or beings that we have marginalized, excluded, oppressed,
right,
and separated ourselves from. In a way, there's nothing wrong. The way this kind of change happens is that one thing grows, reaches its extreme, falls apart, and gives way to something new. Sometimes it looks like the racism, the concentration of wealth, the world-destroying machine, the surveillance state, the military-industrial complex, they're stronger and more powerful than ever. I understand this feeling of burnout and despair. I remember when I was 13 years old, I think it was 1980, I was reading a National Geographic, and that was the first time I became aware of deforestation. It had pictures, maps of forest cover 1900, forest cover 1950, forest cover 1980, it was shrinking every time. And then it had a projection, 2000, 2020. I was horrified. But I was like, phew, at least the scientists know about it now. At least it's in National Geographic. So certainly something will be done. And you can say the same thing about the awareness of climate change that emerged around the same time. Surely something will be done, But nothing was done. if anything, the despoliation of the planet accelerated. And so it sure seems like things are worse than ever. But I think that as the superficial structures have become hardened and even more dominant than ever, the ideological core of our system is hollowing out. We don't really believe in these defining narratives very much anymore. Even the politicians don't believe in it. Even you get in a private moment, I have a friend who's an earth lawyer in the UK, Polly Higgins. Maybe some of you know her work. She's campaigning for ecocide to be added as the 5th crime against peace in the Rome Statute of the UN. Really important work, I think. And she was talking to a coal company CEO, and he said, Polly, privately, I don't think we should have a coal industry. This is not sustainable. But my company's engaging in better practices than any of the competitors. And if I said this to my middle management, they'd kick me out. I've got to keep my mouth shut. Meanwhile, everybody in middle management, for the sake of a good story, let's exaggerate and say everybody in middle management is also privately entertaining the same thoughts and also not daring to speak out. So it's kind of like and I've noticed, like when I was a kid, I remember the bicentennial, July 4th, 1976, and everybody was, all patriotic and everything. And today, even my evangelical friends, my far-right Christian friends, their patriotism is kind of this little thing that they do for the kids. It's not like, oh yes, fireworks. It's kind of like Santa Claus. It's not like really deep-set, fervent belief that our society is on the right track and a model for the world. It's become this kind of identity or brand, but it's not a really deep conviction. It's kind of like the way that the Soviet Union was, comparing it to the 1960s when Khrushchev said, "We will bury you," and it wasn't bravado. He was certain of the superiority of the socialist system. He was stating a fact. What to him was a fact. We will bury you. Because the entire Soviet elite fervently believed in the superiority of their system. By the 1980s, the institutions of Soviet communism were just as strong as ever. But none of the elite believed in it anymore. They had this kind of, cynical pretense. And I think that a lot of our politicians are the same way. Get them in a private moment, and they don't believe in the system either. But it's just kind of waiting for someone to say, the emperor has no clothes. We have to add a little twist to that story, though, because it's so that, even if you believe the emperor has no clothes, and somebody else says it, in order not to expose yourself, you might say, "You idiot, how can you say that?" Even though you secretly agree. I had an interesting, this is in a different realm, but I've gotten to know Rupert Sheldrake a little bit. He's a biologist who advances the theory of morphic resonance, which says that a change that happens one place creates a field of change that happens somewhere else, everywhere else. And he was speaking to a small group of scientists about his theories. And he's, public enemy number one as far as the guardians of scientific orthodoxy are concerned. And so he was speaking to a room full of people, and it was not going well. It's like they were rolling their eyes, like literally snorting with derision. And it was terrible, and he finishes the speech, and he's like, goes into the, goes off to the coffee stand, and then people start coming up to him, one by one. Like, Rupert, privately, I agree with you. Like, more than half of the room actually agreed with him. And so we find ourselves trapped still in a story that we privately disagree with. Now, in this room, of course, here's a bunch of people who have repudiated a lot of the story that binds America together as America still. And what I'm saying, though, is that our awakening from that story is an ongoing process that hasn't been completed. I discover in myself all the time habits of separation, habits of judgment, habits of scarcity. I guess I don't really have time to go into what all of those things are. But they come out in our political tactics sometimes in ways that might seem like, identifying the enemy, for example, and arousing hatred and indignation to bring down that enemy. Like, look what happened in Egypt with that strategy. It worked. Mubarak was the enemy, and they brought him down. But then what? Mission accomplished, right? Mission accomplished, everybody go home. Well, he was only the placeholder of what they called the deep establishment or something. I can't remember what they called it, but he was, he's just filling a role. The same thing, all the people that we would like to hate, they're filling a role too. They're not the problem. They are just as much, you could say that the perpetrators are just as much victims as the victims are. And I'm not saying that out of ignorance of what it's like to be poor or black in America. Like, the horrors that happen just under the surface are I carry that with me every day, and I read this kind of stuff. But I also have a glimpse into the eyes of the privileged enough to see how meaningless a lot of those privileges are. To see the marital disharmony, the autoimmune diseases, the strife with teenagers, the suicides, the depression that infiltrates and finds its way underneath the fortress walls. And again, that's another principle of interbeing. What we do to the world, we do to ourselves inescapably, and there's no way to insulate ourselves from that. And our whole system, you could say that our whole civilization is built on the attempt to insulate ourselves from the consequences of our actions. You cause damage, and you create more damage in order to insulate yourself from the damage that you caused. You spray weed killer on the field, and super weeds come up, so you develop a super pesticide to kill the super weeds, and that destroys soil bacteria, so you add some kind of new thing to it, and that poisons the water table, so you ship water in from somewhere else, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea is that the endless wonders of technology will allow us to do that indefinitely, without limit. But we are reaching the limit today, which is bringing us back to ourselves and uncovering the fallacy of that way of seeing the world and birthing us into a new story. And I think that's what unites us. And I would like to just kind of offer that as a guiding narrative and as a kind of a call to alliance, as a way to say, like, we are comrades, we are brothers, and because we are serving the same thing. I guess the final thing I'll say, if the world is built on a story, then at bottom, the key to effective activism is to change the story, which could be to disrupt the old story, or it could be, to offer a new one. To fill the empty space created by the collapse of the old story. The old story is collapsing anyway, one way or another. Unless you believe that infinite growth is possible on a finite planet, the old story is going to collapse. It's just a matter of when. Will it be when every last vestige of goodness, truth, and beauty on the planet has been consumed and converted into money? Or is it going to be a little earlier than that? When does the addict hit bottom? For some, it's on the deathbed, and for some, it's a little earlier. And my goal is to raise bottom. So anything that we can do to disrupt the stories that run our society today is a political act, fundamentally a political act. We can disrupt them on a superficial level or on a deeper and deeper and deeper level. So we can disrupt the story of America, paragon of freedom and democracy around the world. We can disrupt the story of ignorant, lazy, poor black people. We can disrupt the story of the natives' welcome development because it raises their living standards. We can disrupt the story of GDP equates to human well-being, but we can also disrupt deeper stories that I've been naming as the story of separation, the story of ascent, the story of conquest, the story of domination, those things. And so even on a personal level, the idea of prefigurative politics that was very, very popular at Occupy Wall Street. Yeah, thank you. That says that our own internal organization, relationships, tactics, strategies should reflect the kind of society that we're going to create, that we want to create. Because if we do ever come into power, then what kind of people are we going to be? How do we know what we're going to be like? Never in history has an authoritarian revolutionary movement created an open society. So by who we are being, we prefigure the world that we're creating. We're aligning ourselves to it. And I think that means that we can take that beyond the organizational level all the way down to the personal level and say that any act that violates the old story, any act that gives somebody an experience of not being separate, that gives somebody an experience that it's not a war of each against all, that it's not a world full of separate competing individuals, that it's not a world of us versus them. Even tiny experiences of generosity, forgiveness, mutual aid, community, all of these things, they change they shift the substructure underneath our institutions. You say, what's the cause of climate change? Is it CO2 and methane and et cetera, deforestation? Well, yes, but what's the cause of those things? You come down to it, and the cause, what causes people to overconsume? Is it that they're bad? Is it greed? Or is it that they are living in an ongoing sense of insecurity and scarcity? Greed doesn't make sense if you live in a gift economy, a gift culture, where if you have more than you need, you share it. And therefore you feel secure because you know that no matter how much you give, you'll be fine because people will take care of you too. So, so greed is an artifact of a system that creates artificial scarcity. One of the other speakers today mentioned that. We have more than enough food on this planet. We have more than enough of everything to meet everybody's needs. But the scarcity is a part of our system. So anyway, I need to end, but I'll just say, I just want to validate not only the big political action, the stuff that happens on a big platform or the guy standing up in front of everybody else, again, kind of part of the old story, the expert, but also the visible work done more by women actually than men, that maybe no one ever even finds out about. Maybe you're taking care of an aging relative or a handicapped young person or something like that. And how is that going to contribute to climate change? But you're changing the field and the experience of life, the scarcity, the fear that drives our ecocide machine. So I think I'll end with that. Thank you.
Great, so we have about 15, 20 minutes, something like that for questions, and then there will be books available over there.
Did you stop
and
it?
Nope.
Your other instructions I'm supposed to convey are that everything on your table, almost everything is compostable. And the compost bins, I guess, are back there. When you get up to leave, you can just bust your stuff and drop it either in the compost bin or the recycling bin. Those are your instructions, and otherwise, we'll take questions. At the back of the room, Dave.
David.